In the dusty town of Cedar Ridge, where tradition ruled with an iron fist and women were expected to bow their heads and accept their fate, one young woman's refusal to marry a wealthy rancher's son would spark a chain of events that would forever change the lives of everyone involved. What started as a simple act of defiance would become a story of courage, unexpected love, and the price of standing up for what you believe in. Sometimes the most unlikely hero appears when you least expect it, wearing worn leather boots and carrying the scent of the open range on his clothes. This is the true story of how a determined cowboy's single moment of bravery saved not just one woman's future, but awakened an entire community to question everything they thought they knew about love, duty, and the right to choose your own destiny. The morning sun cast long shadows across the wooden floors of the Morrison farmhouse as Sarah Elizabeth Morrison stood by the kitchen window, watching her father Harold pace back and forth in the yard. His heavy boots kicked up small clouds of dust with each agitated step, and she could see his jaw working the way it always did when he was wrestling with a decision that would affect the entire family. Sarah had always been different from other girls in Cedar Ridge. At 22, she was considered well past the age when most young women in their small Montana town had already settled down with husbands and started families. While her childhood friends were busy tending to babies and managing households, Sarah spent her days helping her father manage their struggling farm, her hands as rough and capable as any man's from years of hard work. The drought of 1923 had hit their community particularly hard. What had once been fertile fields now stretched out like a brown carpet of disappointment, and many families were facing the very real possibility of losing everything they had worked for generations to build. The Morrison farm, which had been in the family for over 40 years, was no exception. Bills were piling up, creditors were making increasingly frequent visits, and Harold Morrison was running out of options. Inside the house, Sarah's mother Margaret sat at the kitchen table, her usually steady hands trembling slightly as she sorted through a stack of unpaid bills. The worry lines around her eyes had deepened considerably over the past few months, and her once vibrant spirit seemed to diminish a little more each day. She looked up as Sarah approached, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Your father has been out there for over an hour," Margaret said softly, glancing toward the window. "Ever since Thomas Whitmore rode over this morning." Sarah felt her stomach tighten at the mention of that name. Thomas Whitmore was one of the wealthiest men in 3 counties, owner of the largest cattle ranch in the territory and a man who was accustomed to getting whatever he wanted. His visits to their humble farm were becoming more frequent, and each time he came, Sarah noticed how her parents' expressions grew more strained and their conversations became hushed whispers behind closed doors. The screen door creaked open, and Harold Morrison stepped inside, his face bearing the weight of a man who had been cornered by circumstances beyond his control. He was a good man, Sarah knew that without question. Throughout her entire life, he had been patient, kind, and had always encouraged her independent spirit even when others in town criticized him for raising a daughter who was too headstrong for her own good. "Sarah, sit down," he said quietly, his voice carrying a tone she had never heard before. "We need to talk." Margaret reached across the table and took Sarah's hand as she sat down, and the gesture sent a chill through her. This felt like the kind of conversation that would change everything, and Sarah wasn't sure she was ready to hear what her father had to say. Harold cleared his throat and looked out the window for a moment before turning back to his daughter. "Mr. Whitmore has made us an offer," he began, each word seeming to cause him physical pain. "He's willing to pay off all our debts, give us enough money to keep the farm running for the next 5 years, and ensure that your mother and I never want for anything again." Sarah waited, knowing there had to be more to this offer than simple generosity. Thomas Whitmore wasn't known for his charitable nature, and he certainly wouldn't offer such an enormous sum of money without expecting something significant in return. In exchange, Harold continued, his eyes unable to meet hers, "he wants you to marry his son, David." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, heavy and suffocating. Sarah felt as though someone had knocked the wind out of her lungs. David Whitmore was known throughout the territory as a spoiled, arrogant young man who had never worked a day in his life and who treated everyone he considered beneath his social status with open disdain. The thought of spending the rest of her life tied to such a person made her feel physically ill. "Papa," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You can't be serious." Harold's shoulders sagged, and, for the first time in her life, Sarah saw her strong, capable father look truly defeated. "I don't see any other way, sweetheart." The bank is threatening to foreclose next month. We've tried everything else. If we don't accept this offer, we'll lose everything, and I don't know what will happen to us then. Margaret squeezed Sarah's hand tighter, tears beginning to form in her eyes. We're so sorry, dear one. If there were any other way. Sarah stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. There has to be another solution. I'll work harder, we can sell some of our livestock, maybe take on additional jobs in town. Anything but this. You think we haven't considered all of that? Harold asked, his voice rising slightly with frustration and pain. Do you think this is easy for me? Do you think I want to hand my only daughter over to a family that sees her as nothing more than a business transaction? But sometimes life doesn't give us the choices we want, Sarah. Sometimes we have to make sacrifices for the people we love. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner and the sound of Margaret's quiet crying. Sarah looked at her parents, really looked at them, and saw how much this decision was tearing them apart. They weren't asking this of her because they didn't love her or because they didn't care about her happiness. They were asking because they were desperate, because they were out of options, and because they couldn't see any other way to survive. How long do I have to decide? She asked finally, her voice steady despite the turmoil raging inside her. Mr. Whitmore wants an answer by the end of the week, Harold replied. The wedding would take place next month if you agree. Sarah nodded slowly, then walked to the window and stared out at the drought-stricken fields that had been her whole world for as long as she could remember. Somewhere out there, she knew, there had to be another way. There had to be a solution that didn't involve sacrificing her entire future for the sake of financial security. That evening, as the sun began to set behind the mountains, Sarah saddled her horse and rode into town. Cedar Ridge was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and she was certain that news of the Whitmore proposal would be spreading through the community like wildfire. She needed to think, to clear her head, and to figure out if there was any possible way out of this situation. The main street was quiet as she tied her horse outside Murphy's general store and walked slowly down the wooden sidewalk. A few people nodded to her as they passed, and she could see the curiosity in their eyes. Word was already getting around. As she reached the end of the street, where the buildings gave way to open fields, she noticed a lone figure sitting on the steps of the old abandoned church. The building had been empty for years, ever since the new church had been built closer to the center of town, but something about the solitary figure drew her attention. As she got closer, she realized it was a man she had seen around town but had never actually spoken to. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that looked like it had been tousled by the wind, and he wore the simple clothes of a working cowboy. There was something about the way he sat there, staring out at the horizon, that suggested he was dealing with his own set of problems. Evening, she said as she approached, not wanting to startle him. He looked up, and she was struck by the kindness in his dark brown eyes. Evening, Miss Morrison, he replied, tipping his hat slightly. I'm Jake Sullivan. I work for the Miller Ranch just outside of town. Sarah had heard the name before. Jake Sullivan had arrived in Cedar Ridge about 6 months earlier, looking for work and keeping mostly to himself. The story she had heard suggested he was a hard worker and an honest man, but beyond that, he remained something of a mystery to most of the townspeople. Mind if I sit? She asked, gesturing to the steps beside him. Not at all, he said, moving over to make room for her. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, both lost in their own thoughts as they watched the last rays of sunlight paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Finally, Sarah found herself speaking, perhaps because this stranger felt safe, or perhaps because she desperately needed to voice her fears to someone who wasn't emotionally invested in her family's situation. Do you ever feel like your life is being decided by everyone except you? She asked quietly. Jake was quiet for a moment before responding. More often than I'd like to admit, he said. Sometimes it feels like we're all just pieces on a chessboard, being moved around by people who think they know what's best for us. Sarah turned to look at him more closely. There was something in his voice that suggested he spoke from personal experience, and she found herself curious about what circumstances had brought him to their small town. What brought you to Cedar Ridge? She asked. Jake smiled slightly, but there was sadness in his expression. Running from a life that other people had planned out for me, he said simply. My family back in Texas had very specific ideas about who I should be and what I should do with my life. When I finally realized that their dreams for me weren't the same as my own dreams, I decided it was time to find out who I really was when nobody else was making the decisions for me. Sarah felt a connection to this stranger that surprised her. Here was someone who understood what it felt like to have your future mapped out by other people, someone who had actually had the courage to walk away from those expectations and forge his own path. Do you ever regret leaving? She asked. Sometimes, he admitted. Especially when I think about how much my decision hurt the people I care about. But, then, I remember that living a lie, even a comfortable lie, isn't really living at all. A person has to be true to themselves, or else they end up losing who they really are. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah found herself telling this virtual stranger about her family's situation, about the proposal from Thomas Whitmore, and about the impossible choice she was being asked to make. Jake listened without judgment, offering no advice or solutions, just the gift of someone who understood what it meant to feel trapped by circumstances. I keep thinking there has to be another way, she said finally. But, every time I try to come up with an alternative, I run up against the same problem. We need money, and we need it fast. I don't know how to make that happen without accepting this arrangement. Jake was quiet for a long time, and Sarah began to worry that she had shared too much with someone she barely knew. But, when he finally spoke, his words surprised her. Money problems can be solved, he said thoughtfully. There are always ways to earn money, to find work, to make a living. But, once you marry someone you don't love, once you tie your life to theirs, that's not something that can be easily undone. That's a decision that affects every single day for the rest of your life. As Sarah rode home that night, Jake's words echoed in her mind. She had 3 more days to make her decision, 3 more days to find an alternative, or 3 more days to come to terms with a future she had never wanted for herself. But, for the first time since her father had delivered Thomas Whitmore's proposal, she felt like someone understood what she was going through, and that understanding gave her a small spark of hope that maybe, somehow, there might be another way. Little did she know that her chance encounter with the quiet cowboy on the steps of an abandoned church would prove to be the beginning of a series of events that would change not only her own life, but the lives of everyone around her in ways she could never have imagined. The next morning brought no relief from the weight of the decision that hung over Sarah's head like a storm cloud. She woke before dawn, as was her habit, and went about her morning chores with mechanical precision, feeding the chickens, milking their 2 remaining cows, and gathering eggs while her mind raced through possibilities that seemed to lead nowhere. Her parents moved around the kitchen with unusual quietness, the normal morning conversation replaced by the kind of careful politeness that people use when they're trying to avoid talking about the one thing that dominates everyone's thoughts. Harold sat at the table longer than usual, staring into his coffee cup as though it might contain answers, while Margaret busied herself with tasks that didn't really need doing, her way of coping with anxiety that threatened to overwhelm her. Around mid-morning, Sarah decided she needed to get away from the oppressive atmosphere of the house. She told her parents she was going to town to pick up supplies, which was true enough, though her real motivation was simply to be somewhere else, anywhere else, where she could think more clearly. The ride into Cedar Ridge gave her time to consider her situation from every angle. She had spent most of the night awake, trying to come up with alternatives to the Whitmore arrangement, but every idea she considered seemed to fall apart when she examined it closely. They could try to get a loan from the bank, but Harold had already exhausted that possibility months ago. They could attempt to sell part of their land, but, in the current economic climate, finding a buyer with ready cash would be nearly impossible. She could look for work in town, but the small salary she might earn would barely make a dent in their debt. As she tied her horse outside Murphy's General Store, Sarah noticed Jake Sullivan loading supplies into a wagon parked nearby. He looked up as she approached, and his face broke into a gentle smile that seemed to ease some of the tension she had been carrying. "Good morning, Miss Morrison," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "How are you holding up?" The simple question, asked with genuine concern, nearly brought tears to her eyes. In a community where everyone knew her business but few people seemed to really care about how she was feeling, his kindness stood out like a beacon. "I'm managing," she replied, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. Jake glanced around to make sure no one was within earshot, then lowered his voice. I've been thinking about our conversation last night, he said. I might have an idea, if you're willing to hear it. Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. I'm willing to listen to anything at this point. Not here, he said quietly. Too many years. Would you be willing to meet me this afternoon? There's an old line shack about 2 miles east of town, near Miller's Creek. Do you know the place? Sarah nodded. She had ridden past the abandoned building many times over the years. It had once been used by cowboys during cattle drives, but it had been empty for several years since the main trails had shifted to accommodate the railroad. I'll be there around 3 o'clock, Jake continued. But I want you to know that what I'm thinking about suggesting, well, it's not exactly conventional. Some people might call it scandalous. The word scandalous would normally have given Sarah pause, but desperate times called for measures that wouldn't normally be considered. I'll be there, she said simply. The rest of the morning dragged by with agonizing slowness. Sarah completed her errands in town, picking up the few supplies her family could afford, and trying to ignore the looks and whispered conversations that followed her wherever she went. News of the Whitmore proposal had indeed spread through the community, and she could see the mixture of curiosity, sympathy, and judgment in people's eyes as they watched her. At Murphy's store, she overheard Mrs. Henderson talking to Mrs. Cole about the situation. That poor girl, Mrs. Henderson was saying in a voice loud enough to ensure that Sarah could hear every word. Though I suppose she should be grateful that David Whitmore is willing to marry someone from such a modest background. Mrs. Cole nodded sagely. Still, it's not natural, a girl her age being unmarried for so long. Perhaps this arrangement will work out for the best after all. Sarah gritted her teeth and focused on her shopping, determined not to give the gossips the satisfaction of seeing how their words affected her. But, inside, she felt a familiar burning anger at the way people in this town seemed to think they had the right to judge her choices and determine what was best for her life. By the time she finished her business in town, Sarah was more determined than ever to hear what Jake Sullivan had to suggest. Whatever his idea was, it couldn't be worse than spending the rest of her life married to David Whitmore and knowing that every day of that marriage was built on the sacrifice of her own desires and dreams. The ride to the old line shack took her through some of the most beautiful country in the territory. Even in the midst of the drought, the landscape had a stark beauty that never failed to move her. Rolling hills stretched out in every direction, dotted with hardy scrub brush and the occasional stand of cottonwood trees that marked the location of a creek or spring. In the distance, the mountains rose like ancient guardians, their peaks still capped with snow despite the summer heat. Sarah arrived at the line shack a few minutes before 3 o'clock and found Jake's horse already tethered nearby. The building was small and simple, just 4 walls and a roof, but it was solid and well-maintained despite its abandonment. Jake was sitting on a wooden crate outside the door, and he stood as she approached. "Thank you for coming," he said, his expression serious. "I wasn't sure you would." "I told you I was willing to listen to anything," Sarah replied as she dismounted. "I meant it." Jake nodded and gestured for her to sit on another crate that he had apparently placed there for her. For a moment, he seemed to be gathering his thoughts, and Sarah could see that whatever he was about to propose was difficult for him to voice. "What I'm going to suggest," he began slowly, "is going to sound crazy at first. But I want you to hear me out completely before you make any judgments." Sarah nodded, her curiosity intensifying. "The way I see it," Jake continued, "your family's main problem is debt, and the only solution anyone has offered requires you to sacrifice your freedom and your future. But what if there was a way to solve the financial problem without that sacrifice?" "I'm listening," Sarah said. Jake took a deep breath. "What if you married someone else? Someone who wouldn't expect a traditional marriage, someone who would be willing to help your family financially without expecting you to give up who you are?" Sarah stared at him, not sure she had heard correctly. "Are you suggesting I find someone else to make the same kind of arrangement with?" "Not exactly," Jake said, his voice quiet but steady. "I'm suggesting you marry me." The words seemed to hang in the air between them like a physical presence. Sarah felt her mouth drop open, and, for several seconds, she couldn't find her voice at all. "But we barely know each other," she finally managed to say. "That's true," Jake acknowledged. But that might actually work in our favor. Listen to what I'm proposing before you dismiss it entirely. Sarah nodded, still stunned by the unexpected direction their conversation had taken. I've got some money saved up, Jake continued. Not as much as Thomas Whitmore, but enough to pay off your family's immediate debts and keep them afloat for a while. More importantly, I've got skills and experience that could help make your farm profitable again. I know cattle, I know farming, and I know how to work hard. But why would you want to help us? Sarah asked. What would you get out of this arrangement? Jake was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was softer than before. A chance to build something real, he said. A chance to be part of a family that cares about each other. A chance to use my skills for something more meaningful than just earning wages for someone else. And the marriage part? Sarah asked, her cheeks flushing slightly. Would be in name only, Jake said quickly. At least at first. I'm not suggesting we rush into anything romantic or intimate. I'm suggesting a partnership, a business arrangement if you will, with the possibility that maybe, over time, we might discover we actually care about each other. Sarah stood up and walked a few steps away, her mind reeling with the implications of what Jake was proposing. It was certainly unconventional, perhaps even shocking by the standards of their community. But, as she thought about it, she realized it might also be brilliant. People would talk, she said finally. People are already talking, Jake pointed out. The question is whether you want them talking about how you married for love and took control of your own life, or how you were sold off to pay your family's debts. The truth of that statement hit Sarah like a physical blow. Jake was right. Either way, she was going to be the subject of gossip and speculation. At least this way, she would be choosing her own path. What about your family in Texas? She asked. Wouldn't they expect you to marry someone they approved of? Jake smiled grimly. My family disowned me when I left, he said. They made it clear that my choices were my own, and the consequences would be too. So I'm free to make my own decisions about who I marry and how I live my life. Sarah turned to face him again. This is insane, she said, but there was wonder in her voice rather than rejection. Maybe, Jake agreed. But sometimes insane solutions are the only ones that work when you're facing impossible situations. Over the next hour, they discussed the practical details of what Jake was proposing. He would pay off the Morrison family's immediate debts, which would give them breathing room to make the farm profitable again. He would work the land alongside Harold, bringing his knowledge and experience to bear on their problems. Sarah would continue to live with her parents initially, maintaining the appearance of propriety while she and Jake got to know each other better. What if we get married and, then, discover we can't stand each other? Sarah asked. Then, we'll deal with that when it happens, Jake replied. But, right now, the alternative is for you to marry David Whitmore, and you already know you can't stand him. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, Sarah found herself seriously considering Jake's proposal. It was risky, unconventional, and would certainly cause a scandal in their conservative community. But, it was also a chance to save her family's farm while maintaining her freedom to choose her own future. I need to talk to my parents, she said finally. This affects them too, and they have a right to know what I'm considering. Of course, Jake said. But, Sarah, whatever you decide, you need to decide soon. You've only got 2 more days before you have to give Thomas Whitmore an answer. As Sarah rode home that evening, her mind was buzzing with possibilities and fears in equal measure. Jake Sullivan's proposal offered a way out of her impossible situation, but it also represented a leap into the unknown that could have consequences she couldn't foresee. But, as she thought about the alternative, about spending her life as David Whitmore's wife, about watching her spirit slowly crushed under the weight of a loveless marriage, Jake's offer began to seem less like a crazy risk and more like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. The question now was whether she would have the courage to grab hold of it, and whether her parents would understand that sometimes the most unconventional choices were also the wisest ones. Time was running short, and decisions had to be made that would affect not only her own future, but the future of everyone she cared about. The evening air was thick with tension as Sarah approached the farmhouse, her conversation with Jake Sullivan playing over and over in her mind like a song she couldn't stop humming. The windows glowed warmly with lamplight, and she could see her parents' silhouettes moving about inside, probably preparing dinner and wondering where she had been for so many hours. As she unsaddled her horse and settled him in the barn for the night, Sarah tried to organize her thoughts. How could she possibly explain to her parents that a virtual stranger had proposed marriage as a solution to their financial problems? How could she make them understand that this unconventional arrangement might actually be better than the one Thomas Whitmore was offering? When she finally entered the house, she found Harold and Margaret sitting at the kitchen table, their dinner plates barely touched and their faces etched with worry. They looked up as she came in, and Sarah could see the questions in their eyes. "We were starting to worry," Margaret said softly. "You've been gone for hours." Sarah hung her hat on the peg by the door and joined them at the table. For a moment, none of them spoke, and the only sound in the room was the steady ticking of the grandfather clock and the distant lowing of cattle in the fields. "I need to tell you something," Sarah began, her voice steadier than she felt. "I met with someone today who has offered us another option." Harold's head snapped up, and Sarah could see a flicker of hope cross his weathered features. "What kind of option?" "Marriage," Sarah said simply. "But not to David Whitmore." Margaret's hand went to her throat, and Harold leaned back in his chair as though he had been physically pushed. "What are you talking about?" he asked. Sarah took a deep breath and began to explain her conversation with Jake Sullivan. She told them about his background, his savings, his experience with farming and cattle, and his proposal for a marriage that would be a partnership rather than a traditional arrangement. As she spoke, she watched her parents' faces carefully, trying to gauge their reactions. When she finished, the room fell into silence again. Harold rubbed his jaw thoughtfully, while Margaret stared at her hands folded in her lap. "This man," Harold said finally. "Jake Sullivan. What do you know about him really? Where does his money come from? Why would he want to help people he barely knows?" "I don't know all the answers to those questions," Sarah admitted. "But I know what I've observed about him. He works hard, he's honest with the people who employ him, and he treats everyone with respect regardless of their social position. Mr. Miller speaks highly of him, and you know how particular Mr. Miller is about the men he keeps on his payroll." Margaret looked up at her daughter with eyes that seemed to hold a mixture of hope and fear. "And you would be willing to marry this man? To tie your life to his when you don't really know him?" "I would be willing to take that chance," Sarah replied. "Because the alternative is to tie my life to David Whitmore, and I do know him. I know he's selfish and cruel and that he sees women as possessions rather than as human beings. At least with Jake Sullivan, there's the possibility that we might grow to care for each other. With David Whitmore, I know for certain that would never happen." Harold stood up and began pacing the small kitchen, his boots creating a familiar rhythm on the wooden floor. Sarah had seen him do this countless times over the years when he was working through a difficult problem, and she knew better than to interrupt his thought process. "The financial aspect would certainly solve our immediate problems," he said after several minutes. "And if this Sullivan fellow is as capable as you say, having extra help with the farm could make all the difference in getting us back on our feet." "But it's such a risk," Margaret added quietly. "What if he's not the man he appears to be? What if his intentions aren't as honorable as he claims?" "Everything in life is a risk, Mama," Sarah said gently. "The question is whether this risk is better than the certain misery of the alternative." Harold stopped pacing and looked directly at his daughter. "What does your heart tell you, Sarah? Setting aside all the practical considerations, what do you feel about this man?" It was a question Sarah had been asking herself ever since Jake had made his unexpected proposal. "I feel like he sees me as a person rather than as a problem to be solved," she said slowly. "When I talk to him, I don't feel like I have to pretend to be someone I'm not. There's a kindness in him, and a strength that doesn't need to prove itself by diminishing others. That's more than many marriages start with," Margaret observed quietly. Harold returned to his chair and looked at both women for a long moment. "If we're going to consider this seriously," he said, "I want to meet with this Jake Sullivan myself." I want to look him in the eye and hear his proposal firsthand. A man's character shows through when he's speaking directly to the father of the woman he wants to marry. I think that's wise, Sarah agreed. I'm sure he'll be willing to meet with you. And we need to think about the practical details, Harold continued. How would this arrangement work exactly? Where would you live? What would be expected of both parties? These things need to be clear from the beginning to avoid misunderstandings later. Over the next hour, they discussed every aspect of Jake's proposal that they could think of. Margaret worried about what the community would think of such a hasty marriage to a relative stranger. Harold focused on the financial and practical elements, wanting to ensure that any arrangement they entered into would truly benefit the family rather than simply trading one set of problems for another. Sarah found herself defending Jake and his character, which surprised her. She realized that in the short time she had known him, she had developed a genuine respect for him and a trust in his integrity that went beyond simple desperation for an alternative to the Whitmore arrangement. I'll send word to him tomorrow, Sarah said as they finally concluded their discussion. I'll ask him to come here tomorrow evening so you can meet with him properly. And if we decide to move forward with this, Harold said, when would the wedding take place? As soon as possible, Sarah replied. We only have until the end of the week to give Thomas Whitmore our answer. If we're going to choose a different path, we need to do it quickly. That night, Sarah lay awake staring at the ceiling of her small bedroom, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling and the distant calls of nightbirds in the fields. 24 hours ago, her future had seemed predetermined, a path that led inevitably toward a marriage she dreaded and a life that would slowly strangle her spirit. Now, suddenly, there was another possibility, uncertain and unconventional but filled with potential for something better. She thought about Jake Sullivan sitting on the steps of the abandoned church, his quiet strength and his understanding of what it meant to have your life planned out by other people. She thought about the way he had listened to her fears without trying to minimize them or offer easy reassurances. Most of all, she thought about his proposal, not just the practical aspects of it, but the underlying message that she was worth more than a business transaction and deserved a chance to choose her own destiny. The next morning dawned bright and clear, and Sarah woke with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in weeks. After completing her morning chores, she saddled her horse and rode to the Miller Ranch to find Jake. She found him in the corral, working with a young horse that was learning to accept a saddle. The skill and patience he demonstrated with the skittish animal reinforced her positive impression of his character. "Good morning," she called out as she approached. Jake looked up and smiled, but she could see the tension in his face as he waited to hear her response to his proposal. "My parents want to meet with you," Sarah said without preamble. "Tonight, if you're willing." Relief flickered across Jake's features. "Of course. What time would be convenient?" "Come for supper at 6 o'clock, Sarah replied. "And, Jake, my father is going to ask you some direct questions about your background and your intentions. He's not trying to be difficult, but he needs to feel confident that he's making the right choice for our family." "I wouldn't expect anything less from a good father," Jake said. "I'll be there, and I'll answer any questions he has honestly." That evening, Sarah watched nervously as Jake Sullivan rode up to their farmhouse precisely at 6 o'clock. He had clearly taken care with his appearance, wearing his best clothes and having recently shaved and cut his hair. But, more importantly, there was something in his bearing that spoke of a man who was prepared to stand behind his words with action. Harold and Margaret were equally nervous as they welcomed Jake into their home. The initial conversation was polite but somewhat stiff, as each party tried to get a sense of the others. But, as they shared the simple meal that Margaret had prepared, the atmosphere gradually became more relaxed. After dinner, Harold suggested that the men step outside to have a private conversation. Sarah and her mother cleared the table in tense silence, both of them straining to hear the murmur of voices from the front porch but unable to make out the words. "What do you think of him?" Margaret asked quietly as she washed the dishes. "I think he's exactly what he appears to be," Sarah replied. "An honest man who's willing to work hard for what he wants and who treats people with respect." "And do you think you could learn to love him?" It was a question Sarah had been avoiding, even in her own thoughts. "I think I could learn to care for him," she said carefully. And I think he's the kind of man who would never ask more of me than I was willing to give. After what seemed like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, the men returned to the house. Harold's expression was thoughtful but not troubled, which Sarah took as a good sign. "Mr. Sullivan has made a fair and honest proposal," Harold announced. "If you're willing to accept it, Sarah, then your mother and I give our blessing to this arrangement." Sarah felt her knees weaken with relief. "And you, Mr. Sullivan?" she asked, turning to Jake. "Are you certain this is what you want?" "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," he replied, his dark eyes meeting hers steadily. "Then, I accept," Sarah said simply. Over the next few days, preparations for the wedding moved forward with surprising speed. Jake proved true to his word about the financial assistance, arriving the very next morning with enough money to pay off the most pressing debts and provide working capital for the farm's immediate needs. Harold was amazed at both the amount and Jake's willingness to hand it over before any official agreements had been signed. The wedding was planned for Saturday morning, just 3 days before the deadline Thomas Whitmore had set for their answer to his proposal. It would be a simple ceremony at the new church in town, with only immediate family and a few close friends in attendance. As word spread through the community about Sarah Morrison's sudden engagement to the mysterious cowboy, the reactions ranged from shock to admiration to scandalized disapproval. But Sarah found that she cared less and less about other people's opinions as the wedding day approached. For the first time in months, she felt like she was making her own choices and taking control of her own destiny. On Friday evening, as she made final preparations for the ceremony, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Thomas Whitmore himself arrived at their farmhouse, his face thunderous with anger and his manner more intimidating than she had ever seen it. "I understand congratulations are in order," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm as Harold reluctantly invited him inside. "Thank you," Sarah replied calmly, though her heart was pounding. "I also understand that you've chosen to marry a drifter with no family and no prospects rather than accept the generous offer I made to your family." "I've chosen to marry a man who sees me as more than a business transaction," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. Whitmore's face darkened further. "You'll regret this decision, Miss Morrison. You're throwing away security and social position for what? A romantic fantasy that will crumble as soon as reality sets in." "Perhaps," Sarah acknowledged. "But it will be my choice to make and my mistake if it turns out to be one." Thomas Whitmore stared at her for a long moment, and Sarah could see that he was not accustomed to being refused or challenged. "Your loss," he said finally. "Don't come crawling back to me when this foolishness falls apart." After he left, Sarah sat on the front porch and looked out at the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. Jake Sullivan, embarking on a journey that was uncertain but chosen freely. Whatever the future held, she would face it with her dignity intact and her spirit unbroken. In the distance, she could hear the sound of Jake's horse approaching for their final conversation as single people. As his familiar figure emerged from the darkness, Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had made her choice, and whatever came next, it would be the result of her own decision rather than someone else's plan for her life. Saturday morning dawned with the kind of crisp, clear sky that seemed to promise new beginnings and fresh starts. Sarah woke before sunrise, not from anxiety but from an excitement she hadn't expected to feel. Today she would marry Jake Sullivan, a man she had known for less than a week but who had already proven himself to be more honorable and considerate than many men she had known her entire life. Margaret had been awake even earlier, preparing a special breakfast and fussing over the details of Sarah's wedding dress. The dress itself was simple, a blue cotton dress that Sarah had worn to church on special occasions, but Margaret had spent the previous evening adding small touches of lace and embroidery that made it seem more suitable for such an important day. "You look beautiful, dear one," Margaret said as she helped Sarah with the final preparations. "But, more than that, you look happy. I haven't seen that light in your eyes for months." Harold appeared in the doorway, dressed in his best suit and holding his hat nervously in his hands. "The wagon is ready," he announced. "We should probably head into town soon if we want to arrive on time." The ride to Cedar Ridge was quiet but not uncomfortable. Sarah sat between her parents on the wagon seat, watching the familiar landscape roll by and thinking about how different everything would look to her by the time they made this journey home again. She would be a married woman, embarking on a life that was completely different from anything she had ever imagined for herself. As they approached the church, Sarah could see a small gathering of people outside the building. Most of the faces were familiar, friends and neighbors who had come to witness her wedding despite the unusual circumstances surrounding it. But there were also some faces she didn't recognize, and she assumed these were men who worked with Jake at the Miller Ranch. Jake was standing near the church steps, dressed in a dark suit that looked new and well-tailored. When he saw their wagon approaching, his face broke into a smile that seemed to light up his entire countenance. As Harold helped Sarah down from the wagon, Jake approached and offered her his arm. "You look absolutely lovely," he said quietly, his voice warm with genuine admiration. "Thank you," Sarah replied, feeling suddenly shy despite all the conversations they had shared over the past few days. The wedding ceremony itself was simple but heartfelt. Reverend Matthews, who had known Sarah since she was a child, performed the service with a dignity that lent weight and meaning to the unusual circumstances. When Jake spoke his vows, promising to honor and cherish Sarah and to be a faithful partner through all the challenges life might bring, his voice was steady and sincere. When Sarah spoke her own vows, promising to stand by Jake's side as they built a life together, she found that she meant every word more than she had expected to. The moment when Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife felt surreal to Sarah. Jake's kiss was gentle and respectful, a promise of affection rather than a claim of ownership, and she found herself responding with a warmth that surprised her. After the ceremony, the small gathering moved to the church hall for a simple reception that Margaret had organized with help from several of the other women in town. The mood was festive despite the quick planning, and Sarah was touched by the genuine good wishes she received from most of the attendees. Mr. Miller, Jake's employer, approached the couple during the reception with a congratulatory smile. "Jake, I want you to know that your job will always be waiting for you if you need it," he said. "But I have a feeling you're going to be too busy making your own success to worry about working for someone else." "Thank you, sir," Jake replied. "That means more than you know." As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself observing her new husband as he interacted with their guests. She noticed how he treated everyone with the same courtesy and respect, from her father to the youngest children who had come with their families. When elderly Mrs. Patterson needed help reaching something from the serving table, Jake was immediately at her side. When young Tommy Henderson spilled punch on his shirt, Jake knelt down to help clean it up without a moment's hesitation. These small acts of kindness reinforced Sarah's growing conviction that she had made the right choice. Whatever challenges lay ahead in their marriage, she was confident that Jake Sullivan was fundamentally a good man who would treat her with decency and respect. As the reception was winding down, Thomas Whitmore made an unexpected appearance. He entered the church hall with his usual air of arrogant confidence, followed by his son David, whose expression suggested he would rather be anywhere else. The room fell noticeably quiet as people noticed their arrival. "I thought I should come and offer my congratulations," Thomas Whitmore announced in a voice that carried to every corner of the room. "Though I must say I'm surprised to see so many people celebrating such a hasty decision." Jake stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of Sarah in a gesture that was protective without being aggressive. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Whitmore," he said politely. "I'm sure you have many demands on your time." "Indeed I do," Whitmore replied, his eyes moving appraisingly over Jake as though he were evaluating livestock. "I wonder if you have any idea what you've taken on, young man? Managing a woman like Miss Morrison requires a firm hand and considerable patience." Sarah felt her temper flare at being discussed as though she weren't present, but before she could respond, Jake spoke in a voice that was calm but carried an unmistakable edge of steel. "I think you misunderstand the nature of our arrangement, sir," Jake said. "I haven't taken on the task of managing anyone. Sarah is my wife, not my property, and she's perfectly capable of managing herself." The room was now completely silent, and Sarah could feel the tension crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. Thomas Whitmore was clearly not accustomed to being contradicted, especially by someone he considered to be beneath his social station. "How refreshing," Whitmore said with a cold smile. "I'm sure that attitude will serve you well when reality sets in and you discover what it really costs to support a wife and maintain a struggling farm. I appreciate your concern, Jake replied, his voice remaining steady. But, I'm confident we'll manage just fine. Whitmore stared at Jake for a moment longer, then turned his attention to Sarah. When this romantic nonsense falls apart, and it will, don't expect my offer to still be available. I wouldn't dream of it, Sarah replied, finding her voice at last. I'm quite satisfied with the choice I've made. After the Whitmores left, the mood in the room gradually returned to its previous warmth, though Sarah could tell that the confrontation had unsettled some of their guests. Jake's handling of the situation, however, had clearly impressed many of the men present, and she noticed several of them approaching him to shake his hand and offer words of support. As the sun began to set, the reception came to a natural conclusion. Harold and Margaret hugged their daughter goodbye, and Sarah could see tears in her mother's eyes despite her efforts to remain cheerful. You'll be staying in town tonight, Margaret said quietly. Mrs. Patterson has offered you her guest room. Tomorrow Jake will help you move your things to the farm. Sarah nodded, feeling suddenly nervous about this transition from the familiar rhythms of her childhood home to the uncertain territory of married life. Jake seemed to sense her apprehension and offered his arm as they walked toward Mrs. Patterson's boarding house. Are you having second thoughts? He asked quietly as they made their way down the main street of Cedar Ridge. No, Sarah replied, somewhat surprised to realize she meant it. Just nervous about the unknown, I suppose. That's natural, Jake said. I'm a little nervous myself. This is new territory for both of us. His honesty was comforting, and Sarah felt some of her tension ease. At least they were embarking on this journey together, as partners rather than as strangers forced together by circumstances. Mrs. Patterson had prepared a lovely dinner for the newlyweds, and she tactfully retired early to give them privacy for their first evening as husband and wife. They sat in her small parlor, drinking coffee and talking about their plans for the farm and their hopes for the future. I've been thinking about what we discussed regarding the cattle operation, Jake said. If we can get the herd rebuilt and improve the grazing land, we could have a profitable operation within 2 or 3 years. What would that involve exactly? Sarah asked, genuinely interested in the practical aspects of their partnership. Over the next hour, Jake outlined his ideas for diversifying their farming operation, improving their livestock breeding program, and implementing some of the newer agricultural techniques he had learned in Texas. His knowledge was extensive and his plans were well thought out, but what impressed Sarah most was the way he spoke about their future as a genuine partnership where her opinions and ideas would be valued. I don't want you to feel like you have to change who you are because we're married, Jake said as the evening drew to a close. I admire your independence and your strength. Those qualities are part of what drew me to you in the first place. And I don't want you to feel like you have to take care of me, Sarah replied. I want to be a true partner in whatever we build together. As they prepared to retire to their separate rooms, Jake took Sarah's hand gently. I want you to know that you can trust me, he said seriously. I know our marriage began as a practical arrangement, but I hope that over time it can become something more meaningful for both of us. I hope so too, Sarah replied, and she found that she genuinely meant it. The next morning, Jake arrived early to help Sarah move her belongings to the farm. As they loaded her few possessions into the wagon, Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation about beginning this new chapter of her life. The ride to the farm gave them another opportunity to talk about their plans and expectations. Jake spoke about some improvements he wanted to make to the property, including repairs to the barn and the addition of a small workshop where he could maintain equipment and handle some of the blacksmith work that the farm required. When they arrived at the Morrison farm, Harold was waiting with a smile and a list of projects he had been thinking about. The three of them spent the morning walking around the property, assessing what needed to be done and making plans for the work ahead. It's going to take some time and effort, Harold said as they concluded their survey, but I think we can make this place prosperous again. I'm not afraid of hard work, Jake replied. And I'm looking forward to seeing what we can accomplish together. As Sarah watched her father and her new husband discussing their plans, she felt a sense of hope that she hadn't experienced in months. For the first time since the drought had begun to threaten their livelihood, the future looked bright with possibility rather than dark with fear. That evening, as she prepared for her first night as a married woman living in her childhood home with her new husband, Sarah reflected on the remarkable turn her life had taken. A week ago, she had been facing a future that seemed predetermined and suffocating. Now, she was embarking on a journey that was uncertain but chosen freely, with a man who respected her as an equal partner. Whatever challenges lay ahead, and she knew there would be many, she would face them with her dignity intact and her spirit unbroken. More importantly, she would face them with a partner who valued her for who she was rather than seeing her as a problem to be solved or a possession to be acquired. As she drifted off to sleep in her own familiar room, with Jake settled in the small guest room down the hall, Sarah felt a sense of peace and anticipation that had been missing from her life for far too long. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but it would also bring the chance to build something meaningful with a man who had already proven himself worthy of her trust and respect. 6 months after the wedding, the Morrison farm had transformed from a struggling operation on the brink of failure into a thriving enterprise that was the envy of neighboring ranchers. Jake's knowledge of modern farming techniques, combined with his tireless work ethic and the renewed hope that came with financial stability, had worked what many in the community called a small miracle. The changes went far beyond mere financial success. The house itself seemed to radiate a warmth and contentment that had been missing during the darkest days of the drought. Harold moved with the spring in his step of a man who no longer carried the weight of impending failure on his shoulders. Margaret hummed while she worked in her garden, which was flourishing thanks to the new irrigation system Jake had designed and installed. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation had occurred in Sarah herself. The tension and anxiety that had marked her features for months had been replaced by a quiet confidence and a genuine happiness that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. She had found in Jake not just a capable business partner, but a companion who challenged her intellect, respected her opinions, and, gradually, without either of them fully realizing when it had happened, had captured her heart. The realization that she had fallen in love with her husband came to Sarah on a crisp October morning as she watched Jake working with a difficult horse in the corral. She had been observing him for several minutes, admiring his patience and skill, when he looked up and caught her eye. The smile he gave her was warm and intimate, filled with an affection that went far beyond mere partnership or friendship, and she felt her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with practical arrangements or financial necessity. That evening, as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Sarah found the courage to voice what had been growing in her heart for weeks. "Jake," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something." He turned to look at her, and she could see concern flickering in his dark eyes. "What is it?" "I've been thinking about our arrangement," she began, then stopped, realizing that calling their marriage an arrangement no longer felt accurate or fair to either of them. Jake's expression grew more serious. "Are you having regrets? Because if you're not happy." "No," Sarah said quickly, reaching out to take his hand. "Just the opposite, actually. I'm happier than I ever thought possible, and that's what I want to talk about." Relief flooded Jake's features, followed by something that looked very much like hope. "When we got married," Sarah continued, "it was supposed to be a practical partnership. A solution to a problem. But, somewhere along the way, it became something more for me. You became more to me." Jake's hand tightened around hers. "What are you saying, Sarah?" "I'm saying that I love you," she said simply. "Not as a business partner or as someone who solved my family's financial problems, but as a man. As my husband. As the person I want to spend the rest of my life with." For a moment, Jake was completely still, and Sarah worried that she had misread the signs, that perhaps his feelings for her hadn't developed in the same way hers had for him. But then, he lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I've been in love with you for months," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I was just waiting for you to be ready to hear it." "Why didn't you say anything?" Sarah asked. "Because I wanted you to come to it on your own," Jake replied. "I didn't want you to feel like I was pressuring you or taking advantage of our situation. I wanted you to choose to love me, not feel obligated to." Sarah leaned forward and kissed him, then, a real kiss, filled with all the love and desire and hope that had been building between them over the months of their unconventional courtship. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathless and smiling. "So what happens now?" Sarah asked. "Now we build the life we both want," Jake said. together, as real partners in every sense of the word. That night, for the first time since their wedding, Sarah moved from her own room into the one she would share with Jake as his true wife. The transition felt natural and right, the final step in a journey that had taken them from strangers thrown together by necessity to partners who had chosen each other freely and completely. The following months brought new challenges and new joys. The farm continued to prosper under Jake's innovative management and Sarah's careful attention to the business side of their operation. They expanded their cattle herd, improved their crop yields, and began to establish themselves as one of the most successful agricultural operations in the territory. But their personal happiness had an impact that reached far beyond their own property lines. Word of their success spread throughout the community, and other young people began to question the traditional arrangements their parents were trying to make for them. If Sarah Morrison could find both love and financial security by choosing her own path, perhaps there were other ways to approach marriage and family life than simply accepting whatever their elders decided was best. Emma Patterson, the banker's daughter, broke off her engagement to a man twice her age and instead married the young teacher who had recently arrived in town. The Hendricks twins, both of whom had been facing pressure to marry wealthy but much older ranchers, instead pooled their resources and started their own business breeding and training horses. The changes weren't universally welcomed, of course. Thomas Whitmore and others of his generation grumbled about the breakdown of traditional values and the dangerous precedent being set by allowing young people to make their own choices about marriage and career. But their complaints carried less weight as the success stories mounted and the community began to see that perhaps the old ways weren't always the best ways. Jake's transformation was equally remarkable. The quiet, somewhat mysterious cowboy who had arrived in Cedar Ridge with little more than his skills and his savings had evolved into a respected member of the community whose advice was sought on everything from farming techniques to business investments. But, more importantly, he had found the sense of belonging and purpose that had been missing from his life since he had left his family in Texas. One evening in late spring, as they sat on their porch watching their cattle graze in the distance, Sarah brought up a subject they had been discussing more frequently lately. "I think I'm ready," she said quietly. Jake looked at her questioningly. "Ready for what?" "To start a family," Sarah replied, her cheeks flushing slightly. "I want to have children with you, Jake. I want to raise them here, on this land that we've built together." Jake's face lit up with joy. "Are you sure? There's no rush. We have all the time in the world." "I'm sure," Sarah said firmly. "I want our children to grow up knowing that they can choose their own paths, that they don't have to accept whatever fate others try to impose on them. I want them to see what's possible when people treat each other as equals and work together toward common goals." 6 months later, Sarah discovered she was expecting their first child. The news was greeted with celebration throughout the community, and even some of their former critics seemed to soften their attitudes toward the unconventional couple who had defied expectations and created something beautiful from what had started as necessity. Harold and Margaret were overjoyed at the prospect of becoming grandparents, and they threw themselves into preparations for the baby with an enthusiasm that reminded everyone why family was so important. Margaret began sewing baby clothes and blankets, while Harold started work on a cradle that would be both functional and beautiful enough to become a family heirloom. As Sarah's pregnancy progressed, Jake became even more attentive and protective, though he was careful not to treat her as though she were fragile. He continued to value her opinions and include her in all major decisions about their operation, understanding that her mind was as sharp as ever even as her body changed to accommodate their growing child. The baby arrived on a snowy February morning, a healthy boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's determined chin. They named him Matthew, after Jake's grandfather, and, from the moment he was placed in Sarah's arms, she knew that her life was complete in a way she had never imagined possible. As she watched Jake hold their son for the first time, tears streaming down his face as he whispered promises about the kind of father he would be and the kind of world he would help create for this child, Sarah marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. Less than 2 years ago, she had been a woman facing a future that seemed predetermined and hopeless, trapped by circumstances and other people's expectations. Now she was a wife, a mother, and a successful businesswoman who had helped build something meaningful and lasting. More importantly, she was a woman who had learned that sometimes the most unconventional choices led to the most extraordinary outcomes. The story of Sarah and Jake Sullivan became something of a legend in Cedar Ridge and the surrounding territory. Parents began to tell their children about the young woman who had refused to accept the fate others tried to impose on her and the cowboy who had seen her worth when others saw only a problem to be solved. Their farm became a symbol of what was possible when people were willing to take risks, work hard, and treat each other with respect and dignity. Years passed, and more children came to fill their house with laughter and love. Matthew was joined by two sisters, Elizabeth and Catherine, each of whom grew up with the understanding that they could be whatever they chose to be and that their parents would support them in pursuing their dreams. Jake never returned to Texas, but he did eventually reconcile with his family through letters and visits from relatives who were curious about the life he had built in Montana. When they saw the respect he commanded in his community and the obvious happiness of his family, even his father admitted that perhaps his son had made the right choice after all. Sarah's transformation from reluctant bride to fulfilled woman inspired other young people throughout the territory to question traditional expectations and seek their own paths to happiness. She became an unofficial advisor to young women facing similar pressures, always encouraging them to remember that they had more options than they might realize and that their own happiness and self-respect were worth fighting for. The farm continued to prosper and expand, eventually becoming one of the largest and most successful operations in the territory. But Jake and Sarah never forgot the lessons they had learned during those early days when they were building their partnership from nothing but mutual respect and shared determination. Thomas Whitmore's predictions about the failure of their romantic nonsense proved to be entirely wrong. His own son David eventually left Cedar Ridge altogether, unable to live up to his father's expectations and unwilling to change his arrogant and entitled attitude toward others. The Whitmore Ranch, once the symbol of success and power in the community, gradually declined as other, more progressive operations surpassed it. As Sarah approached her 40th birthday, she often reflected on the choices that had shaped her life. Sometimes she wondered what would have happened if Jake Sullivan had never come to Cedar Ridge, or if he had lacked the courage to propose his unconventional solution to her family's problems. But then, she would look at her children, her thriving farm, and the man who would become not just her husband but her best friend and greatest love, and she knew that everything had happened exactly as it was meant to. The story of how a determined cowboy had said not today to an arranged marriage and changed the course of multiple lives became part of the folklore of the American West. It was a story about courage, about the importance of choosing your own path, and about the extraordinary things that could happen when people were willing to see each other as individuals worthy of respect and love rather than as problems to be solved or possessions to be acquired. But, most of all, it was a love story, proof that sometimes the most beautiful relationships grow from the most unlikely beginnings and that real love is worth waiting for, fighting for, and building a life around. In a time and place where women's choices were often limited and their voices frequently ignored, Sarah Morrison Sullivan had found a way to create the life she wanted and had inspired others to do the same. The little church where they had been married became a popular destination for young couples who wanted to begin their own unconventional love stories, and the old line shack where Jake had first proposed their arrangement was preserved as a reminder that sometimes the most important conversations happen in the most unexpected places. And, in the evenings, when the work was done and the children were asleep, Jake and Sarah would often sit on their porch and watch the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, grateful for the day when a cowboy had looked at a desperate situation and decided that there had to be a better way, grateful for the courage they had both found to choose love over convention, and grateful for a life that had turned out to be far more beautiful than either of them had ever dared to dream.